When life gets unpredictable, preparation matters. In medicine, it's all about staying alert, ready for whatever comes through the door. On the road, it's no different. That's why Volvo designs vehicles to help anticipate risk, reduce harm, and protect lives. The Volvo XC90's advanced safety systems inspire confident decisions wherever the road takes you. The Volvo XC90, for life. Proud sponsor of the Pit Podcast. Learn more at volvocars.ca/safety.
Welcome back to the Elias Macko Show. Now a story that we've wanted to talk about for a few days here, but we've been waiting for the right moment and the right person to talk about it. There was a bombshell report earlier in the week on the French media side of things from Radio-Canada that revealed that Hydro-Quebec hasn't collected on bills to certain Indigenous communities totaling $250 million. Now there is a debate swirling on what to do here. Should Hydro-Quebec collect the $250 million? It is a very touchy situation. We've asked Geoff Kelley to come onto the program, of course, a longtime Liberal MNA and former Indigenous Affairs Minister. Geoff, welcome to the program.
Good morning, Elias.
It seems like when this story came out, everyone, if government-wise, hydro-wise, walking on eggshells. I probably with good reason. Why don't you give us your take on this bombshell story this week?
Well, maybe start with 2 points. I think it's reported in one of the papers this morning that over 80% of Indigenous people do pay their bills. So we do have a tendency to sweeping generalizations. So I think it's important first to remind people that most Indigenous people do pay their hydro bills. Secondly, I agree with the principle that you should pay for any service that you receive. So the troubles that Hydro-Quebec has in recovering this money is a very serious issue. So I'm not denying that, but I think it's important just to remind people that most people in Indigenous communities do pay. And it is true, because I've sat in on many meetings, relations between Hydro-Quebec and certain Indigenous communities are never easy, particularly those communities that were most affected by building dams and upsetting traditional ways of life, which isn't a justification for not paying the bills, but it's part of the context. And secondly, I think it's important to remember that many of these communities are very poor, and collecting money in poor communities is a challenge everywhere as well. So that's a little bit of the portrait. But as I say, I'm not trying to justify the non-payment of these bills, but I can understand that collecting them in the context of a reserve where it's all social housing, so it's not like you can put a lien on a home or anything else like this. The ability to go after money in these poor communities is somewhat limited.
And Geoff, could you fill our listeners in? Over the years, haven't certain communities come to agreements with the government, with Hydro-Quebec, to be reimbursed for the things that, for the use of lands and what happened to lands, let's say in hydroelectric projects over the years and dams that were done? Haven't there been certain communities that have come to the table, come to a deal with the government, and yet we find some people aren't paying their bills?
Exactly, and most notably is the James Bay and Northern Quebec Agreement, which was the comprehensive agreement signed almost 50 years ago, which permitted the construction of the dams in the James Bay region. So it's a very generous, it has helped the Cree Nation to build infrastructure and everything else like this. So the Cree have had a special relationship with Hydro-Quebec due to that. Those communities in eastern Quebec, in the Innu First Nations, a lot of the construction was prior to the 1970s. So dams along the Manicouagan River, the Sainte Marguerite River, and others, there was limited compensation. So there is a bit of an unbalance, if you will, between the treatment the Cree received, because our appreciation of Aboriginal rights had improved by the 1970s compared to the 1950s and 1960s when some of the big dams were built in eastern Quebec.
So what do you think, Geoff, should be done here? As you pointed out right off the top, the vast majority of Indigenous communities are paying their bills, and I think this is so unfair to them. Like if I found out this week that I've been paying my bills forever and my neighbors may or may not have been, and they haven't been for years, up to the tune of $250 million, I'd be angry, right? So how do you think the government in Hydro-Quebec should be handling this?
Well, I mean, Hydro-Quebec will have to approach it community by community. I remember I was surprised, honestly, about the size of the amount of money that is owed, but this issue did come up when I was minister from time to time. And on occasion, they would hire someone local, some very brave soul who in the community would work out the agreements to get people to repay. But even as an MNA, there were people in my riding who would fall behind. And the one thing that's very difficult in these things is between the penalties and the combined interest, very quickly you fall way behind. And if you don't have much means and your hydro bill is $20,000 or whatever, it can take you a very long time to pay that back. But Hydro-Quebec has experience in working out these kind of arrangements to recoup the money, and as long as you sign up to recoup the money, even if it's a fairly modest sum, the interest and a little bit more, but it's going to be that is the only solution. But you have to go, because if not, as you say, if your neighbor gets away with not paying for it, like, why am I paying for it? I'm a chump. So I think it's very important to try to make the efforts. And one of the things that seems to have been a change in policy this summer at Hydro-Quebec to stop trying to collect this money, and I think that's a mistake.
So, Geoff, we're with Geoff Kelley, former Indigenous Affairs Minister, longtime Liberal MNA. Geoff, one of the questions that's being asked right now is the timing that this story comes out. And people are asking, how did this story come out? Thomas Gerbet, Radio-Canada, that dropped this story on Monday. People are wondering, was it a leak from government? Was it a leak from Hydro? Someone who's not happy at Hydro? Obviously, we've had a change of at the top at Hydro with Michael Sabia now running the show there. Do you have any idea about why now? Why this story comes out this week?
My only idea is it's obviously a very good question, Elias. Obviously, there's been tension in the last few weeks between Hydro-Quebec and the government. There was the departure of Minister Fitzgibbon. There's the whole debate over the choice of Northvolt for a significant amount of electricity that's been reserved for that project that may or may not go forward. So obviously there's a lot of turbulence. So trying to figure out in whose advantage is this? Is it an advantage? I'm not exactly sure whose advantage it is to make this public, but you're quite right. It's a very pertinent question, and as I say, the relationship right now between Hydro-Quebec and the government seems to be a little bit rocky. Mm-hmm. The other consideration is for Hydro-Quebec's future, they're thinking of perhaps other dams in eastern Quebec, so relations with the Innu Nation are very important. And the point I also make, and I made it when I was minister, is 2041 may sound like a long way away, and you say, why am I picking that date? Well, that's when the agreement with Newfoundland and Labrador over the Churchill Falls Agreement comes to an end. Uh-huh. So that'll have to be renewed, and in the 1960s, you could do a deal with that like that without any Indigenous participation. But I think when it comes to 2041 or the period leading up to 2041, there'll be an Innu voice at the table as well. So I think both the government and Hydro-Quebec have every interest in improving relations with the Innu Nation.
Just quickly here to wrap up, Geoff, could a solution be when the government is making deals with Indigenous communities that the agreement says, listen, here's the money that you're going to get, but you are in charge of collecting from the members of your community their hydro bills. So if they don't pay, it's the community that at the end of the day loses out. Should that how things maybe should be switched up, that the communities themselves are responsible for recouping the money?
You could try that. I think there are going to be a lot of communities that say it's not our job to do your job. Mm-hmm. So I think it's worth a try, Elias, but I wouldn't bet heavily on it being received, welcomed in the communities in question, but it's worth a try.
Geoff, thank you so much for your insight on the subject. Really appreciate it.
Good talking to you, Elias.
That's Geoff Kelley, former Indigenous Affairs Minister, longtime Liberal MNA.